Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to get this talk. You see the title here, Exploration and Production Challenges, a Way Forward. That was the talk that Dr. Garg gave me, and I realized that probably the biggest challenge is getting all the things that I wanted to say in the 15-minute time period that I have allotted. I also added a geochemical perspective to the title because I'm actually a geochemist. I'm not a geologist or an engineer. I've been doing this for a long time, and we're obviously at the University of Oklahoma very involved in exploration and production research. And I sort of want to share some of the things that we're doing and show you how that these may overcome some of the challenges as we go forward. Now, we know that the first oil well was drilled back in 1859. There have been many challenges in exploration and production since that time. There have been many dramatic cycles of price fluctuations, and many times we've heard that the world's oil supply is running out. But it appears right now that we're far from that point and seem to be awash with oil again. Many of the predictions in the past where people have said that we're running out of oil have been incorrect. The predictors of these amounts are rarely challenged, and many times that their predictions are forgotten by the time that we pass the deadline. And then we have to think about who could have predicted the impact of the shale revolution 20 years ago. Just to illustrate that, here are a couple of predictions that were published, one back in the 1950s by a famous geologist in the U.S., King Hubbert. He predicted oil production would peak in the 1970s. We're way past that, obviously. Then he came up with a revised prediction that we would be peaking, oil production would be peaking just around 2010. Well, obviously that's incorrect as well. And these predictions keep changing with time. And it seems that we have, as exploration techniques improve, then we continue to find new reserves of oil. Now, back in the, when the first well was drilled in 1859, obviously that was somewhat based on luck, not entirely on luck, but a lot of the early exploration techniques were simply based on surface expressions. If there was a seep visible in the case of oil, the idea was to drill there and hopefully you would find more oil a little deeper down in the subsurface. Well, obviously we've come a long way since then. Oh, I did find this when I was doing the research for this particular talk. And obviously many of you should know this already, seeing that you're Indian and actually living here. But the birthplace of the Indian oil industry is in Digboy. And from what I observed or what I read, the first expression of oil found there was again related to an oil seep, and there were some elephants that were I think they were being used in the forest, and one of these elephants emerged from the forest one day with oil on its feet, and so that was really the first discovery of oil in India. Now, we've come a long way since then, but there's still many challenges. And of course, right now, as some of the speakers this morning alluded to in the introduction as well, this time of volatile oil and gas prices is a major economic challenge itself. I'm not going to deal with the economics. I'm not an economist, so that's not my field of expertise. But I can certainly tell you from experience of what we're seeing in the U.S. and Oklahoma in particular, which is a big oil-producing region. The companies there are undergoing large-scale layoffs. There's been a great reduction in exploration activity. There are many wells that are being shut in, and production is being reduced quite significantly. But on the other hand, as we see these lower prices, I think in the future, again, this will lead to more efficient exploration and production tools. And I'll talk about some of those a little bit later on. And I think a lot of these improvements can be related back to the improvement that we're gaining from our understanding and knowledge of the processes involved in the generation and accumulation of oil and gas. That may seem like a very basic statement, and you'd think by now we would have learned everything that we need to know about the processes involved in the generation and accumulation. But I can tell you from what we found and other research laboratories have found, there's still a lot to be learned. I'll talk a little bit about the impact of the shale revolution, because there are ideas that have emerged from that that are going to be very useful in the future. I think another challenge that we face is the disruption of the supply chain. We find, of course, during the good years, the graduate students from our program and other universities get multiple job offers, good, well-paying jobs. But in cases like this right now, the graduate students that are looking for jobs to start in September once they graduate, they're just not there. They're not even getting internships. So this tends to turn people off. And so then there becomes a gap and a shortage of geologists or engineers that will go into the field. And then we've got the loss of the experienced workers that are being laid off. And so I think this is a challenge. I'm not going to talk about it, but I think it's something that we need to think about. And again, as I said, the economic issues and ramifications are very widespread. But I'm not going to talk about those either because that's outside of the scope of this presentation. But I also believe that we need to find a better balance between exploration and the environment, the impact of exploration and production on the environment. There are many issues that we could talk about here in terms of environmental problems related to drilling, production, transportation, climate change. We've heard a little bit about climate change this morning in the coal business. There are certainly issues in the oil business there as well, and I'll touch on a couple of those in just a moment. As I said, I will make a brief mention about some things related to shale gas and shale oil, and also talk about some processes where we've seen significant advances in source, rock, and reservoir characterization. In terms of the environmental issues, these are just four issues that I think are very important. The picture up in the top left is a picture of the BP rig that exploded and collapsed in the Gulf of Mexico a few years ago, causing a significant contamination and pollution problem there. The one on the top right is a picture of a train that was a very large train, a very long train carrying oil in Canada. This train was basically parked for the night, and maybe you read about this, but it was parked in a siding at night, and the engineer had not applied the brakes properly. It ran backwards into a little town there and basically blew up in the middle of the town. It killed several people, and obviously burnt down a lot of buildings there. A lot of oil is being transported this way in the U.S., and I've got a slide that will show that in just a moment. But obviously there are a number of issues related to the transportation of oil by train. The slide on the bottom, or the picture on the bottom left, is just a pipeline, or is a pipeline explosion. A gas pipeline exploded in a fairly rural area, but right across an interstate highway. So again, this is a major environmental problem. And then the slide in the bottom right, it's a slightly different issue, and you may have read about this, but in Los Angeles, for the last 3 or 4 months, there's been a very large release of gas from an underground storage cavern. The black plume that you can see there is the gas. It's not just the gas, obviously. There are other things associated with it. But this leak released something like 25%, I think it was, of the amount of natural gas that would have been released in the over a 1 year period. That leak has actually been stopped now. They drilled a relief well and finally stopped the leak over the weekend, apparently. Over the years, we've also seen a lot of accidents occur with tanker transportation. The slide on the left shows the decrease in tanker spills going back to 1970 up to 2015. So that's sort of pretty good news there. A lot less tanker spills occurring as a result of improvements in navigation systems, double-hulled tankers, and things like that. The slide on the right shows the increase in the amount of oil being transported by rail in the U.S. You see a similar statistic for Canada as well. And a lot of this is due to the explosion of the shale oil industry, where large amounts of oil, shale oil, are being produced, particularly in North Dakota, where the pipeline infrastructure is just simply not in place, and this oil had to be taken to the refineries and so on. And so the easiest way to do that in the absence of the pipelines was by rail. And as I showed you before, there can be some very significant accidents, and there have been a lot of derailments and so on. So this is definitely a big challenge for the future. And this is another interesting problem that is related to the environment. The slide on the top right is showing where the Bakken oil fields are. This is in North Dakota, And it's an area, the Bakken Shale is one of these very rich shale oil prospects which has been developed very rapidly over the last 2 or 3 years, or 3 or 4 years, I guess. But the point that I'm showing here is that all of the light that you can see above where it says Bakken oil fields, this is all related to gas being flared in that particular area. This is an oil-producing field, but it produces a lot of gas as well. But the pipeline infrastructure, again, was not in place, and it's been estimated that something like $100 million worth of gas a year was actually being flared there. And of course, if they didn't flare it, the methane would probably be released, and the methane, as we know, is a far worse greenhouse gas than the CO2. So it's the lesser of two evils. But again, I think this has the potential to do a lot of damage to the environment. Now, to go to exploration and production, again, there are a lot of things that I could talk about here, but obviously there's not the time to do that. And so I just want to focus on a couple of issues, both related to shale oil and shale gas. We're not going to talk about the other things. And I'm going to say a few words about hydrofracking, a little bit about better understanding of rock properties, and then I'm going to say a few words at the end about interpreting the heterogeneity of black shales. Hydrofracking is not new. Companies have been hydrofracking wells for many, many years, but of course the big change was when hydrofracking was combined with horizontal drilling. A lot of this development work took place in the Barnett Shale in Texas, and then of course it's expanded to many other areas. And one of the big issues with hydrofracking, if you're not familiar with this, and I think most people are these days, but of course one of the big problems is water. And in Texas in particular, it's been through a period of rather severe drought, and the hydrofracking requires fresh water. You can't use water that has a lot of salts in it, and not only does it use fresh water, but it needs a lot of water. As you see here, a typical Barnett well required between 500,000 and 1 million gallons, it says, of fluid. Well, that fluid is primarily water, a lot of sand, which is the propellant, 700,000 pounds of sand, being pumped down there at 50 to 80 barrels a minute. And of course, there are a whole lot of logistical problems involved with this as well. And then in addition to that, you have the chemicals, a whole range of chemicals that are added to the water. But at the same time, it's been very successful. The slide here that you see on the left-hand side shows production from the Barnett Shale going back to about 1982, I think that is on the left, going up to 2010. And you can see there when the horizontal development started, it took a few years to perfect the technique, but once the technique was perfected, then the amount of production increased very significantly. The graph on the right, though, shows an interesting turnaround because production from the Barnett maximized around 2012. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily running out of gas, but the price of natural gas has declined, and so a lot of the wells there have been shut in. And so you see that from the bar on the far right-hand side shows production from January to November of 2015. So there's definitely been a significant turnaround in the production of gas from the Barnett. And I should just mention about the water again. The next few slides show some other things about water as well. And for those of you that haven't seen anything about fracking before, it's a very straightforward process. It's easy to say it's straightforward. There are a lot of technical issues. But basically, you're pumping water and sand down through the well. And as it's showing over there in the bottom right-hand corner, you hope to induce the fractures. That has to be a very carefully controlled process for a whole variety of reasons. But you fracture, you send sand into the fractures, and then the hope is that you'll produce gas or maybe oil if it's a shale oil prospect, which will then come back up the wellbore. As I said, the big problem here is the water. First of all, you've got to find the water. Then you have the flow back, which is the water that comes back that you pump down there initially to do the fracking. This water comes back, it's carrying salts from the well, from the formation. And then later, after the flow back water is being produced, then you get the produced water, which is in the formation in the first place. And you can see in the slide up, the little box up in the top right, that it was estimated that in 2014, this acquisition of the water, the treatment of the water, and so on, cost something like almost $7 billion. And the slide, the picture in the bottom right, is showing the difference between the fresh water, which is the bottle obviously on the right-hand side, and the produced water, and showing the difference in the quality of that water. And at the same time, another environmental issue here are the locations of the water storage pits that have to be made around these drilling sites. Huge areas to store the water that's needed before the fracking process takes place. The slide on the right shows one of these storage pits very close to an urban area, because in Texas in particular, a lot of these wells are drilled very close to urban areas. Another issue, and we heard this morning about one potential impact of sequestering CO2 in the subsurface was the possibility of earthquakes. In Oklahoma, where there's a lot of shale oil production, the possibility of earthquakes is a reality. On Saturday, for instance, of this past weekend, there were 8 earthquakes. They were relatively small. They ranged between 3 and 5.1 on the Richter scale. But the frequency of these earthquakes has increased dramatically, as you can see from these two maps, comparing the earthquakes between 1980 and 2009, and then from 2014 to 2015. This is not from the fracking process itself. A lot of people think it is. But this is from the pumping down of the formation waters. This is pumped into deep disposal wells, into the underlying formations, very deep in the subsurface. But now I think there's agreement that these disposal wells and all of this water that's being pumped down there is definitely causing these earthquakes. Here's a slide which shows U.S. shale oil production. And again, this was growing substantially. I think it slowed down a lot. The graph actually goes out into 2017, so those are predictions. But those predictions are way off now, and we know, like in Oklahoma again, the production from the shale oil prospects has declined quite significantly. This is a map. These are two maps of Oklahoma. On the left-hand side, it's showing wells that were drilled into the Woodford over a three-year period. The Woodford Shale is a prolific source rock in Oklahoma. It's been producing oil for about the last 100 years. And a lot of the wells that were conventional wells were basically stripper wells. They were producing 1 or 2 barrels of oil a week and like 30 barrels of water. But when the shale oil revolution came along and they started fracking the shale, the production again started to increase significantly. And you can see some numbers on the the map on the right-hand side. The location of the oil is primarily controlled by maturity. You can't see those numbers very well there, but if you look on the map on the right-hand side, the wells that are in black are actually gas producers. The wells to the right of that are the oil producers, and there's some numbers in the boxes down the bottom to show you the amount of oil that's being produced from the different wells. Okay, so another challenge here is to get a better understanding of the rock properties, both from an inorganic and organic perspective. Because in the shale oil and the shale gas business, the rock properties determine where the oil and gas is stored. Initially, when we started producing shale gas, it wasn't clear where the gas was stored. Was it absorbed? Was it free? Was it absorbed to the inorganics? Was it absorbed to the organic material? And basically, through studies like the one you see on the right-hand side, which is showing a focused ion beam SEM picture, the orange-colored areas are showing the organic matter. Well, as the source rock becomes mature, that organic matter starts to degrade and increases the porosity. So you're getting a lot more gas that's being stored in the porosity that's being developed through the thermal destruction of the organic matter. That's where a lot of the gas is stored. In the shale oil prospect, that's where a lot of the oil is stored as well. The picture on the left-hand side shows a photo from some X-ray tomography work, which again, it's doing the same thing. It's looking at the grain sizes, it's looking at the pore spaces, it's looking at the brine and so on, because you need to get a better understanding of the rock structures to understand where that oil and gas is being stored to improve the production. Now, the next thing I want to mention briefly is that these black shales are not homogeneous. For a long time, people had the idea that black shales were homogeneous, and so they thought production would be homogeneous. That's not the case. There's a tremendous amount of variability in the organic composition of the shales. The organic matter is where the oil and the gas comes from. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Rocky Valve data, but that plot on the left-hand side is a Rocky Valve diagram. It's showing the hydrogen index versus the oxygen index. If the organic, and these are all samples from the same formation. Now, if it was a homogeneous shale, they would all plot very closely to each other. But what that graph is showing you is the tremendous variability. And what that means is that you're not going to get uniform production from the shale, either horizontally or vertically. And it's very important that you define the optimum areas for production in these shales. This is another illustration of that. This is the Barnett Shale again. Again, there's not a lot of time to discuss this, but basically what that's showing you there is the variation in the lithophases within this core. There are 9 different lithophases within this core, and the productivity from the different lithophases is quite different. And so you need to define the one that's the optimum for the production. Which one are you going to drill the horizontal well through? Because if you drill it through one of the lithophases that's organic poor, even though it's part of the Barnett, you're not going to get good production. This table is just summarizing those 9 different lithophases on the left-hand side. The thing to look at is the columns that are labeled TOC, total organic carbon. And so we've got 4 wells here, and as you go down through each one of those, you'll see from the phosphatic deposit down to the dolomitic mudstone that the TOC values there may range from 6.8 to 2.3, or even in well 4, the dolomitic mudstone is 1.9. Well, obviously the lithophases you want to target there is one that has a TOC value of around 6, because otherwise if you go down to 1.9, fine, it's still got some organic matter there, but the productivity is not going to be as good as the one at the top. And so basically, this is all related to the organic richness. The phosphatic deposits were deposited under much more highly reducing conditions, much better preservation of the organic matter, and so on. And then here's another quick slide of the Barnett. What we're looking at here is we've got the stratigraphic column there, and we're looking at changes in sea level. So you can see there was quite a bit of variation during the depositional history of that. That parameter on the right-hand side, it's just called RHP. I won't go into details there, but that shows a fairly good variation with changes in sea level. And basically, the deeper the sea level, the better the preservation. And those areas that are marked with the red dot, these are the ones that have the highest total organic carbon value, and so those are the ones that you would want to target for your horizontal drilling. You would combine this with things like a brittleness index and so on, but again, the bottom line is you're trying to target those formations or those lithophases that will give you the biggest and best production. This is my final section. I don't know how we're doing for time, but I got 3 or 4 more slides here because I am a geochemist, and geochemists like to look at molecules in crude oils and source rocks. And this is I think some very exciting research that we're doing. If you're not a chemist, the structures are going to probably drive you crazy. But the thing is that you don't need to even worry about those structures. But these compounds, they're called carotenoids. If you think of a carrot has beta-carotene in it, beta-carotene. Beta-carotene is a carotenoid. But these compounds are associated with green sulfur bacteria. And green sulfur bacteria like to grow under conditions of photic zone eosinia. In other words, they're photosynthetic organisms, but they grow under reducing conditions. And if you can identify the zones where these compounds are growing, you know you're going to get a very rich organic source rock. And these compounds are becoming very powerful compounds to identify highly productive source zones in shale oil prospects. And this is where it becomes, again, this gets into a little bit too much detail for the time that I have here, but the interesting thing about these compounds is that there are several different types of these green sulfur bacteria. It's a little confusing because you get purple sulfur bacteria, green sulfur bacteria, and brown-green sulfur bacteria. But the interesting thing is that these different strains of the bacteria grow at different depths in the water column. And so you can actually start reconstructing the depositional history, the depth of the chemocline, which is where you go from fresh water to water which has got a lot of hydrogen sulfide in it, based on the presence of these different organic compounds. So for those of you that are not organic geochemists or molecular chemists, you can look at compounds in a shale or an oil and get some indication of the depth of the water where these compounds were growing, even if the shales are something like 300, 400 million years old. And again, that becomes important because it's going to help you characterize the depositional environment and then also be able to determine whether or not you've got organic rich source rocks there. This is my last but one slide. This is showing a depth section in the Woodford Shale, again, our prolific source rock in Oklahoma, but it's looking at the variation of two of these compounds with depth. And basically, you can see that as we come up from the bottom of the core and you see the concentrations of those compounds increases quite significantly and then shows a decrease as we get towards the top of the core. And so we can interpret that in terms of changes that were occurring in the deposition environment. We can reconstruct the actual structure of the basin, because you see there at the bottom of the core, we were looking at a very restricted environment with sluggish ventilation, very little circulation. So we have these anoxic conditions, the photic zone anoxia, which again are good conditions for the preservation of the source rocks. So by looking at this molecular chemistry, you get a much better understanding what was going on in the geological record. Now, people have been doing this for a long time, but the thing is, as we look at more of these shales, we're finding new compounds coming up with new interpretations for the depositional environment. And as I said several times, all of this information is useful for the geologists, for the engineers, in terms of delineating those organic rich shales that are the best targets for the horizontal drilling. So again, I'll stop there because I probably ran out of time, but let me just say a few things here, though. Obviously, current conditions are not the most conducive for exploration because the companies aren't spending a lot of money on this type of research at the present time. But at the same time, we need to try and to continue to develop and improve our exploration and production methods. And I think a lot of that, from a geochemical perspective, revolves around better understanding of factors involved in the formation of these organic rich source rocks, particularly for shale gas and shale oil exploration prospects to target the organic rich facies. And once again, this understanding must range all the way from the basin scale down to the grain size and molecular scale. Thank you.